The red recording light blinked steadily in the green drawing room of Windsor Castle as Queen Elizabeth II sat alone, separated from her family for the first Christmas in decades. Outside, the world was gripping with a pandemic that had claimed millions of lives and changed everything people thought they knew about connection, tradition, and hope. At 94 years old, the Queen faced perhaps her most challenging moment as a monarch. How do you comfort a nation when you yourself are isolated? How do you speak of togetherness when families cannot embrace? How do you offer hope when the future feels uncertain? This is the true story of how one woman, carrying the weight of a crown and the hopes of millions, crafted a message that would reach into living rooms across the globe and remind people that even in the darkest times, light finds a way to shine through. What happened behind the scenes of that Christmas message would reveal not just the making of a historic speech, but the very human story of a queen who understood that sometimes the most powerful thing a leader can do is simply acknowledge that we are all walking through the darkness together, searching for the same light. The morning of December 18th, 2020, arrived with a crisp winter chill that seemed to mirror the mood hanging over Windsor Castle. Queen Elizabeth II stood at the window of her private apartments, watching the bare branches of the ancient oak trees sway gently in the wind. The ground stretched out before her, empty except for the security personnel who maintained their vigilant watch. It was a scene that had become all too familiar during the past 9 months. The pandemic had changed everything. The woman who had spent nearly 7 decades meeting people, shaking hands, and being present for her subjects now found herself isolated behind castle walls. The irony was not lost on her that in a year when people needed their monarch most, she was the one person who had to remain furthest away. Her private secretary, Sir Edward Young, knocked softly on the door before entering. He carried with him a leather folder containing the draft scripts for her annual Christmas broadcast. This year, the message carried more weight than usual. People were struggling, families were separated, and the economy was in ruins. The Queen knew that her words would need to do more than simply wish everyone a Merry Christmas. She had been thinking about this speech for weeks. How do you address a nation in crisis? How do you acknowledge suffering without adding to despair? These were questions that kept her awake at night, staring at the ceiling of her bedroom while Prince Philip slept peacefully beside her. The first draft of the speech had arrived from her speechwriters 2 weeks earlier. It was polite, proper, and utterly inadequate. The words felt hollow, like empty platitudes that would float over people's heads without touching their hearts. She had sent it back with a simple note written in her careful handwriting. "We must do better." Sir Edward placed the folder on her desk and waited as she opened it. This was the 4th revision, and she could see immediately that her writers were struggling just as much as she was. How do you capture the magnitude of what the world had experienced? How do you speak to grief that felt too large for words? The Queen picked up her reading glasses and began to review the latest attempt. The opening was better, acknowledging the year's challenges more directly. But as she read further, she felt the same disconnect. These are not her words. They were the words of committee, carefully crafted to offend no one and inspire no one. She set the papers down and walked back to the window. Outside, a groundskeeper was clearing fallen leaves from the pathways. He worked methodically, gathering the brown and yellow remnants of autumn into neat piles. There was something peaceful about watching him work, something that reminded her of the simple dignity in continuing to do your job, even when everything around you had changed. That was when the first real idea began to form. This year had been about continuing, about finding ways to do necessary things despite impossible circumstances. Healthcare workers had continued to care for patients. Teachers had found ways to educate children. Families had discovered new ways to stay connected. The story of 2020 was not just about loss and separation, but about human determination and creativity in the face of unprecedented challenges. She returned to her desk and picked up her fountain pen. In the margins of the draft, she began to write notes. Real stories she had heard about during the year. the nurse who had worked 16-hour shifts for months, the grandmother who had learned to use video calling to read bedtime stories to grandchildren she could not hold, the community groups that had organized food deliveries for elderly neighbors. Prince Philip found her there an hour later, still writing. At 99 years old, he moved more slowly than he once had, but his mind remained sharp. He could see that his wife was wrestling with something important. Struggling with the speech? He asked, settling into the chair across from her desk. I need to get this right. Philip, she said, not looking up from her writing. People are hurting. They need to hear something real, something that acknowledges what they have been through. He nodded, understanding immediately. In their many decades together, he had watched her navigate countless crises. He had seen her find the right words to comfort a nation after terrorist attacks, to celebrate achievements, to mark solemn occasions. But this felt different. This was not about responding to a single event, but about addressing a collective trauma that was still unfolding. What are you thinking? He asked. She set down her pen and looked at him. I keep thinking about light, she said. How even when everything seems dark, people keep finding ways to create light for each other. It was a simple observation, but it resonated with something deeper. Throughout the year, she had heard countless stories of small acts of kindness that had made enormous differences. The neighbors who had checked on each other, the teachers who had driven to students' homes to deliver supplies, the musicians who had performed concerts from their windows. The Queen stood up and walked to the fireplace, where a small fire was crackling cheerfully. She had always found comfort in fire, in the way flames danced and moved with their own mysterious life. Fire had been humanity's first technology for creating light in darkness, and it remained one of the most powerful symbols of hope. I think, she said slowly, that this year has shown us something important about who we are as people. Not just as British people, but as human beings. When everything familiar was taken away, we discovered what was truly essential. Sir Edward, who had been quietly waiting, leaned forward. He could sense that something important was happening, that the Queen was finding her way to the heart of what she wanted to say. She returned to her desk and began writing again, this time with more certainty. The words came more easily now, flowing from the observations she had been making all year. She wrote about the empty chairs around Christmas tables, but also about the new ways families had found to be together. She wrote about the sadness of canceled celebrations, but also about the healthcare workers who had become heroes. As she wrote, she thought about her own experience of the year. At 94, she had been forced to adapt to technologies she had never used before. She had learned to participate in video calls, to conduct meetings through computer screens. It had been humbling to realize that she, like everyone else, had to learn new ways of doing familiar things. The morning stretched into afternoon as she continued working. Sir Edward brought her tea and quietly left again. Prince Philip dozed in his chair, the sunlight from the window warming his face. The Queen wrote and revised, crossed out and rewrote, slowly finding her way to the message she wanted to share. By evening, she had filled several pages with handwritten notes and revisions. The formal draft had been transformed into something more personal, more authentic. She had found a way to acknowledge the year's difficulties without dwelling in despair. She had found words that honored both the struggles and the triumphs of 2020. But she knew the real work was just beginning. Taking these handwritten thoughts and turning them into a speech that would reach millions of people would require careful crafting. Every word would be analyzed. Every phrase would be scrutinized. The balance between comfort and realism, between hope and honesty, would need to be perfect. As she prepared for dinner, the Queen felt something she had not experienced in months. She felt confident that she had something meaningful to say. The message was beginning to take shape, and for the first time since the year began, she believed she could offer her people something they truly needed to hear. The evening light was fading outside the windows of Windsor Castle, but inside the green drawing room, the fire continued to burn brightly, casting dancing shadows on the walls where, in just a few days, the Queen would deliver what would become one of her most memorable Christmas messages. The following morning brought news that would make the Queen's message even more poignant. Sir Edward Young entered her study with updates from across the Commonwealth and the United Kingdom. The numbers were sobering. Infection rates were climbing again, new restrictions were being imposed, and Christmas plans were being canceled across the country. In London, families who had hoped to reunite for the holidays were being told to stay apart. The new variant of the virus was spreading faster than anyone had anticipated, and the government had been forced to implement the strictest measures yet. The Queen read the reports with a heavy heart, knowing that her message would now reach people who were facing their second disappointing Christmas in isolation. But there was other news as well, the kind that reinforced her growing conviction about the resilience of the human spirit. The first COVID-19 vaccines had begun to be distributed just days earlier. Margaret Keenan, a 90-year-old grandmother from Coventry, had become the first person in the world to receive the Pfizer vaccine as part of a mass vaccination program. The image of Mrs. Keenan smiling after her injection had become a symbol of hope that the darkest days might finally be coming to an end. The Queen studied the photograph of Mrs. Keenan that had appeared in all the newspapers. Here was a woman just 4 years younger than herself, taking a brave step into an uncertain future. There was something deeply moving about the elderly leading the way toward recovery, showing younger generations that even in advanced age, there was reason for optimism about the future. This image stayed with the Queen as she continued working on her speech. She had decided to completely rewrite the opening, moving away from the traditional formal greeting to something more immediate and personal. She wanted to acknowledge right from the beginning that this Christmas was different, that everyone watching would be experiencing some form of loss or disappointment. Her speechwriting team arrived at midday for a working session. The group included not just the usual writers, but also historians, theologians, and communication experts. They gathered around the long table in the castle's library, surrounded by books that had witnessed decades of royal speeches and historic moments. Simon McCoy, one of her senior writers, had been working on royal speeches for over a decade, but he admitted that this one felt different. "Your Majesty," he said as they reviewed her handwritten notes, "your instinct to focus on light as a metaphor is powerful. It connects to Christmas traditions, but it also speaks to the very human need for hope during dark times." The Queen nodded, but she was thinking about something deeper. Light was not just a metaphor to her. It was a practical reality. Throughout the year, she had heard stories of people literally creating light for each other. Healthcare workers had strung lights outside hospitals to thank their colleagues. Children had made lanterns to put in windows for neighbors to see. Communities had organized outdoor carol services with candles to maintain traditions while staying safe. Dr. Sarah Mullally, who served as a theological advisor for significant speeches, offered another perspective. The Christian tradition of Christmas is fundamentally about light coming into darkness, she said. But what makes this year remarkable is how we have seen that light multiplied through human actions. Each act of kindness has been like lighting another candle. The Queen found this observation particularly meaningful. She had always understood her role as being, in part, a guardian of traditions and values that connected people across time. But 2020 had shown that these traditions were not fragile artifacts that needed protection. They were living principles that adapted and found new expressions even in the most challenging circumstances. As the afternoon progressed, the speech began to take more concrete shape. The Queen had decided to structure it around the theme of different kinds of light. The light of hope represented by the new vaccines, the light of human kindness shown in countless acts of mutual support, and the light of tradition that had helped people maintain connection to what mattered most. But she also wanted to acknowledge the darkness honestly. Too many Christmas messages, she felt, glossed over real suffering in favor of empty optimism. She had lived through World War II. She had seen how people responded to genuine crisis, and she knew that real hope could only come from honestly acknowledging real challenges. "I want to talk about the empty chair," she told her writing team. "In every family, There will be an empty chair this Christmas. Someone who should be there, but cannot be there. We must acknowledge that absence. The room fell quiet. It was a bold choice to begin a Christmas message by focusing on loss. But the Queen had learned something important during her long reign. People trusted her most when she spoke truthfully about difficult things. Sir Edward Young raised a practical concern. Your Majesty, the broadcast will reach families who have lost people this year. We want to be careful not to add to their grief. The Queen considered this carefully. She had been thinking a great deal about grief during the past year, partly because she had experienced it herself. Several close friends had died during the pandemic, people she had known for decades. She understood the particular pain of losing someone when normal mourning rituals were impossible, when funerals had to be small and embraces were forbidden. I think, she said finally, that acknowledging loss can actually be a form of comfort. When someone in authority says that loss is real and that it matters, it can help people feel less alone with their grief. This led to a lengthy discussion about the balance between sadness and hope. The Queen was determined not to deliver either a depressing message that left people feeling worse or a superficial message that ignored real pain. She wanted something that honored the full complexity of human experience during an extraordinary year. By evening, they had a working draft that felt much closer to what the Queen had envisioned. The opening now acknowledged directly that this Christmas would be different, that many people would be separated from loved ones, and that the year had brought genuine loss and hardship. But it moved quickly to examples of how people had responded to these challenges with creativity, kindness, and determination. The middle section focused on the stories that had emerged during the year. Healthcare workers who had risked their own safety to care for others, teachers who had found innovative ways to educate children, neighbors who had supported each other through lockdowns. These were not abstract examples, but specific stories that had been reported in the news and that people could relate to their own experiences. The conclusion returned to the theme of light, but grounded it in practical hope. The vaccines were beginning to be distributed. Scientists had achieved remarkable breakthroughs in record time, and there is reason to believe that 2021 would bring a gradual return to more normal life. As the Queen reviewed the draft that evening, she felt satisfied with the direction, but knew that the most challenging work still lay ahead. The actual recording would take place in just a few days, and she needed to be completely comfortable with every word. More importantly, she needed to find the right tone, the precise balance between her formal role as Queen and her human understanding of what people were experiencing. Prince Philip joined her for dinner, and she read portions of the speech aloud to him. He listened carefully, occasionally nodding or suggesting small changes in emphasis. After nearly 75 years of marriage, he had become her most trusted advisor on matters of tone and authenticity. "It sounds like you," he said when she finished reading. "Not like a committee trying to sound like you." This was exactly what she had been hoping to achieve. The challenge of any royal speech was to speak with the dignity and authority that the office required, while also connecting with people on a genuinely human level. It was a balance she had been working on for nearly 7 decades, and she felt that this year's message might represent her clearest success in finding that balance. As Christmas week approached, the Queen knew that the coming days would be crucial not just for finalizing her speech, but for understanding exactly how it would be received by a nation and a world that desperately needed to hear something that would help them face an uncertain future with renewed strength and hope. December 21st marked the winter solstice, the longest night of the year, and it seemed fitting that the Queen would spend this day putting the finishing touches on a message about light overcoming darkness. She woke early, as had become her habit during the pandemic, and spent the first hour of daylight reviewing the speech one final time before the technical teams arrived to prepare for filming. Windsor Castle buzzed with carefully controlled activity as BBC crews began setting up equipment in the green drawing room. The room had been chosen specifically because it represented both tradition and intimacy. Unlike the grand staterooms that might have seemed too formal for such a personal message, The green drawing room felt like a space where the Queen might naturally sit with family or close friends. The technical requirements for filming during the pandemic had created unprecedented challenges. Normally, a Christmas broadcast would involve dozens of crew members, but this year everything had been pared down to the absolute minimum. Camera operators wore masks and maintained distance. Lighting technicians worked quickly and efficiently, and even the Queen's usual makeup artist had been replaced by simplified arrangements that she could largely manage herself. Director Jamie Borthwick had worked on several royal broadcasts before, but nothing quite like this. The challenge, he explained to his small crew as they set up, is creating intimacy despite all the distance requirements. Her Majesty needs to feel comfortable and natural, but we also need to maintain all the safety protocols. The Queen watched these preparations with interest. In her nearly 7 decades as monarch, she had witnessed the evolution of television technology from its earliest days. She remembered the heavy, hot lights and enormous cameras of the 1950s, the gradual improvements in picture quality through the 1960s and 1970s, and the digital revolution that had made broadcasting more flexible and immediate. Now, pandemic requirements were forcing another adaptation. What struck her most was how the technical constraints actually served the message she wanted to deliver. The simplified setup, the smaller crew, the more intimate feel of the production, all of these aligned with the theme of finding new ways to do essential things. Just as families were learning to celebrate Christmas differently, the royal Christmas broadcast was adapting to circumstances while maintaining its core purpose. At 10 a.m., the Queen met with her final group of advisors for a last review of the speech. The group included Sir Edward Young, Simon McCoy, Dr. Sarah Mullally, and Professor David Starkey, a royal historian who had been consulted on the historical context of the message. Professor Starkey had prepared a briefing on how this Christmas message fit into the larger tradition of royal Christmas broadcasts. "Your Majesty," he said, "this will be your 52nd Christmas broadcast, but in many ways it feels like one of the most important since your first in 1952. That first message was about taking on the responsibilities of the crown. This one is about leading the nation through its darkest modern crisis." The Queen appreciated this perspective, but she was thinking about something more personal. Her first Christmas broadcast had been delivered when she was just 26 years old, newly crowned, and somewhat overwhelmed by the magnitude of her responsibilities. She had been reading from a script prepared entirely by others, trying to sound authoritative while feeling uncertain about almost everything. Now, at 94, she felt the confidence that comes only from decades of experience. She had learned to trust her own instincts about what people needed to hear. She had developed the ability to speak with both royal authority and genuine human warmth. Most importantly, she had learned that the most effective messages came not from trying to sound impressive, but from trying to be helpful. "I keep thinking," she told the group, "about the difference between speaking at people and speaking with people. This year, more than ever, I want people to feel that we are having a conversation, that I am acknowledging what they have experienced and offering thoughts that might actually be useful." This observation led to one final round of small adjustments to the speech. Certain phrases were softened to sound more conversational. A few sentences were shortened to create more natural pauses. The overall tone was adjusted to feel less formal and more personal, while still maintaining the dignity appropriate to a royal Christmas message. By noon, the technical setup was complete, and the Queen was ready for her first practice run. She had changed into a carefully chosen outfit, a bright blue dress that would stand out against the green walls of the drawing room, paired with the sapphire chrysanthemum brooch that had belonged to Queen Victoria. The brooch was particularly meaningful, as it represented the continuity of the monarchy across generations, but also because chrysanthemums symbolized optimism and joy. The first rehearsal revealed several small issues. The lighting needed adjustment to ensure that the Queen's face was clearly visible to viewers. The positioning of the cameras required fine-tuning to create the right balance between formality and intimacy. Most importantly, the Queen herself needed to find the right pace and tone for delivering words that she had been crafting for weeks. "It needs to feel more spontaneous," she told Director Borthwick after reviewing the first take. "Even though every word has been carefully chosen, I want people to feel that I am speaking directly to them in this moment." This was perhaps the greatest challenge of any televised speech, creating the illusion of spontaneity while delivering carefully prepared remarks. The Queen had been working on this skill for decades, but each significant speech required finding the right approach for that particular message and that particular moment. The second rehearsal went better. The Queen had found a rhythm that felt natural, a way of emphasizing certain words and phrases that highlighted the key themes without sounding artificial. She paused meaningfully when discussing loss and separation, but her voice carried genuine warmth when speaking about acts of kindness and reasons for hope. During a break between rehearsals, the Queen walked to the window and looked out at the castle grounds. It was a gray December day, but the winter light had a quality that she found beautiful. Bare trees stood stark against the sky, but they also revealed the elegant structure that was hidden when they were covered with leaves. There was something about winter that simplified everything, that reduced the world to its essential elements. This observation gave her an idea for a small addition to the speech. She had been talking about how the pandemic had stripped away many of the usual distractions and revealed what was truly important in life. The metaphor of winter light, of clarity that comes when everything unnecessary has been removed, might help people understand that some of the discoveries they had made during this difficult year could be lasting gifts. She mentioned this idea to Simon McCoy, who immediately saw its potential. "That's beautiful, Your Majesty. It suggests that even difficult experiences can teach us valuable things about ourselves and about what matters most." A brief addition was crafted and incorporated into the speech. It came near the end, just before the conclusion, and it added a layer of meaning that the Queen felt had been missing. The pandemic had indeed been like winter, harsh, challenging, sometimes seemingly endless. But it had also revealed strengths and connections that might have remained hidden under normal circumstances. The final rehearsal took place in the late afternoon, as the natural light was beginning to fade and the room's lamps created a warm, intimate atmosphere. The Queen felt completely comfortable with the words now, and her delivery had found the perfect balance between authority and warmth, between acknowledging difficulties and offering hope. As the crew prepared for the actual recording, scheduled for early evening, the Queen took a few minutes alone in the room. She sat in the chair where she would deliver the message, looking directly into the camera lens, and thought about all the people who would be watching. Families separated by distance and restrictions. Healthcare workers exhausted from months of extraordinary demands. Children who had missed school and friends. Elderly people isolated in care homes. Young adults whose plans had been disrupted and whose futures felt uncertain. Each of these groups faced different challenges, but they all shared the experience of having their normal lives disrupted and their assumptions about the future challenged. The Queen's task was to speak to all of them simultaneously, to find words that would be meaningful regardless of individual circumstances. As the sun set outside the windows of Windsor Castle, the Queen prepared to deliver what would become one of the most watched and most quoted Christmas messages in the history of the royal broadcasts. She felt ready, not just because the words had been carefully crafted, but because she genuinely believed in the message she was about to share. At 6 p.m. on December 22nd, 2020, Queen Elizabeth II sat in the green drawing room of Windsor Castle, facing a camera that would carry her words to millions of people around the world. The room was quiet except for the soft crackling of the fireplace and the barely audible hum of recording equipment. In just a few minutes, she would begin speaking the words that had been weeks in preparation, but which she now delivered as if they were coming to her naturally in this moment. "Recording begins in 30 seconds, announced the director quietly. The Queen straightened in her chair, her hands folded calmly in her lap. She had chosen to wear Queen Victoria's sapphire chrysanthemum brooch, not just for its beauty, but for what it represented. Like the monarchy itself, it had endured through generations of change, remaining meaningful and valuable despite the passage of time. Tonight, she would need to embody that same quality of enduring relevance. And recording. The Queen looked directly into the camera, and her voice, when she began to speak, carried both the authority of her office and the warmth of genuine human concern. Every year we herald the coming of Christmas by turning on the lights. And light does more than create a festive mood. Light brings hope. The opening words established immediately that this would not be a typical royal Christmas message. Instead of beginning with formal greetings or traditional pleasantries, the Queen launched directly into the central metaphor that would guide her entire speech. Light as hope, light as connection, light as the human response to darkness. She continued, "For Christians, Jesus is the light of the world, but we can't celebrate this year in quite the usual way. People of all faiths have been unable to fully practice their religions as they would wish." This acknowledgement came early and deliberately. The Queen wanted to address immediately what everyone was thinking, that this Christmas was different, diminished in some ways, marked by absence and restriction. But rather than dwelling on these limitations, she pivoted quickly to what had emerged in response to them. But in many ways, we have seen a triumph of the human spirit. We have seen how communities have come together to support those most in need. And we have seen many examples of selfless dedication to duty. As she spoke these words, the Queen thought about the specific stories that had informed this speech. Dr. Catherine Henderson, who had worked 18-hour shifts at a London hospital while her own family remained isolated at home. Marcus Rashford, the young footballer who had campaigned tirelessly to ensure that disadvantaged children received meals during school closures. The thousands of volunteers who had organized grocery deliveries for elderly neighbors they had never met. These were not abstract examples for her. They were real people whose actions had moved her deeply and had shaped her understanding of what this year had revealed about human nature. The pandemic had certainly brought out fear and division, but it had also revealed remarkable capacity for sacrifice and mutual support. The Christmas story retains its appeal since it speaks to all of us about the importance of hope. We need life to go on. When people face a challenge, they sometimes talk about taking a leap of faith. This year, faith has been particularly important, and not just faith in God, but faith in each other. The Queen paused here, allowing the words to settle. She had wrestled with this concept of faith throughout the year. How do you maintain faith when so much seems uncertain? How do you encourage others to have faith when you yourself are grappling with doubt and worry? The answer, she had concluded, lay not in pretending that faith was easy, but in recognizing that faith was most meaningful precisely when it was most difficult. The healthcare workers who returned to hospitals day after day, despite the risks, were demonstrating faith. The teachers who learned new technologies to maintain connection with their students were showing faith. The families who found creative ways to celebrate milestones and maintain traditions were expressing faith in the future. Remarkably, a year that has necessarily kept us apart has, in many ways, brought us closer. Across the Commonwealth, my family and I have been inspired by stories of people volunteering in their communities, helping those in need. This was perhaps the most personal part of the speech for the Queen. She was thinking specifically about her own family's experience of the year. Prince William and Catherine had participated in video calls with healthcare workers. Prince Charles had recovered from his own bout with COVID-19 and had thrown himself into supporting arts organizations struggling with closures. Even the youngest members of the family had found ways to contribute, participating in virtual events and online initiatives. But she was also thinking about the broader definition of family that had emerged during the pandemic. People had expanded their understanding of who they were responsible for and who they could count on for support. Neighbors had become family. Healthcare workers have been adopted as honorary relatives by grateful communities. The traditional boundaries between public and private, professional and personal had blurred in ways that often brought out the best in people. In the United Kingdom and around the world, people have risen magnificently to the challenges of the year, and I am so proud and moved by this quiet, indomitable spirit. The word indomitable had been chosen carefully. It suggested strength that could not be broken, resilience that could weather any storm. But the Queen had paired it with quiet, recognizing that the heroism of 2020 had been largely unglamorous and unrecognized. The real heroes were not those who sought attention, but those who simply continued doing essential work under extraordinarily difficult circumstances. As she continued speaking, the Queen felt the weight of her words in a way that was unusual even for her. She was acutely aware that families watching would be gathered differently than usual, perhaps with some members participating by video call, perhaps missing people who would normally be present. She was speaking in living rooms where people were trying to create Christmas joy while managing genuine sadness and uncertainty about the future. To our young people in particular, I say thank you for the part you have played in this year. I have been inspired by the courage, dedication, and hard work of people across the age range, but my admiration has been particularly sparked by how young people have adapted. This segment had been especially important to the Queen because she had been deeply moved by stories of young people's responses to the pandemic. Students had given up traditional graduation ceremonies without complaint. Young adults had postponed weddings and career plans without bitterness. Children had adapted to online learning and limited social contact with remarkable resilience. The vaccine program has given us real hope for 2021. Of course, we don't yet know when normal life will return, but we can plan ahead with renewed confidence. This acknowledgement of the vaccines represented a carefully balanced position. The Queen wanted to offer genuine hope based on scientific progress, but she also wanted to avoid unrealistic optimism about how quickly things would return to normal. She had been briefed extensively on the vaccine rollout plans, and she understood both the tremendous promise and the logistical challenges that lay ahead. As we look forward to the future, we must remember the lessons this year has taught us, that we can achieve remarkable things when we work together, that the essential workers, who we now appreciate more than ever, deserve our ongoing respect and support, and that even when we are apart, we can still come together in spirit. These lessons have been personally meaningful to the Queen. She had always believed in the importance of duty and service, but the pandemic had shown her new dimensions of what these concepts could mean. She had seen how ordinary people could become extraordinary through their commitment to serving others. And she had been reminded that leadership was not just about giving direction, but about acknowledging and celebrating the contributions of others. As the speech moved toward its conclusion, the Queen prepared to deliver the words she considered most important. Everything that had come before had been building toward this final message of hope and determination. The Queen's voice grew softer but more resolute as she approached the final portion of her Christmas message. The camera captured the gentle flicker of firelight across her face, and, for a moment, the weight of her 94 years seemed to transform into the wisdom that only comes from witnessing nearly a century of human triumph and struggle. Of course, for many, this time of year will be tinged with sadness, some mourning the loss of those dear to them, and others missing friends and family members distanced for safety, when all they'd really want for Christmas is a simple hug or a squeeze of the hand. These words carried particular weight because they came from personal experience. The Queen herself had lost dear friends during the pandemic, people she had known for decades who had succumbed to the virus or simply to the isolation that the pandemic had made necessary. She understood intimately the particular cruelty of grief during a time when normal comfort and consolation were impossible. But more than that, she was thinking about Prince Philip, sitting just out of camera range, who at 99 had become increasingly frail during their months of isolation. She was thinking about her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, whom she had been unable to see and hold as she normally would. The simple human need for physical contact, for the reassurance of touch, had become one of the most profound losses of the pandemic. If you are among them, you are not alone, and let me assure you of my thoughts and prayers." The phrase, "you are not alone," was delivered with particular emphasis. The Queen had been told that this was one of the most common feelings reported by people during the pandemic. A sense of isolation that went beyond physical separation to touch something deeper about human connection and meaning. She wanted to use her platform, her voice reaching millions of homes, to directly contradict that feeling of abandonment. The Bible tells us that a time will come when every tear will be wiped away and there will be no more death, sorrow, crying, or pain. While we cannot embrace that promise this Christmas, we can still rejoice in the hope it brings. This biblical reference had been carefully chosen not just for its religious significance, but for its universal appeal to anyone who had experienced loss. The Queen was not assuming that everyone watching shared her Christian faith, but she was confident that everyone watching understood grief and the need for hope that transcends immediate circumstances. And I believe that hope is found in the God who comes to dwell among us, and also in the response of ordinary people to extraordinary circumstances. We have seen that response again and again this year. It gives us cause to hope for the future. Here the Queen brought together the theological and the practical, the eternal and the immediate. She had observed throughout her reign that the most effective leadership combined respect for transcendent values with attention to concrete human needs. This Christmas message represented perhaps her clearest articulation of how those two dimensions of leadership could work together. Now, as then, when Jesus was born, we believe that light triumphs over darkness. That's the belief that has sustained me through my years of service, and that's what gives me hope for the future as we work together to fight this virus and to build back better afterward. The phrase "build back better" was deliberate and current. It had become a common expression during the pandemic, used by political leaders around the world to suggest that recovery should involve not just returning to previous conditions, but creating something improved. The Queen was embracing this concept while also placing it in a larger context of enduring values and long-term perspective. As she prepared to deliver her final words, the Queen thought about all the Christmas messages she had given over her nearly 7 decades as monarch. Some had marked moments of national celebration. Others had addressed times of crisis or transition. But none had felt quite like this one, delivered in isolation to a world grappling with a shared challenge that transcended national boundaries. So I wish you and all your families a peaceful and blessed Christmas, and I look forward to a brighter 2021. God bless you all. The recording light went off, and for a moment the room was completely silent. The Queen remained in her chair, looking at the camera that had just carried her words around the world. She felt a deep satisfaction, not because the speech had been technically perfect, but because she believed she had successfully conveyed what she had set out to share: acknowledgement of real pain, recognition of genuine heroism, and hope based on both divine promise and human resilience. Director Jamie Borthwick approached quietly. "That was beautiful, Your Majesty. I believe it will bring comfort to many people." The Queen nodded, but she was already thinking about what would happen after the message was broadcast. Words were important, but they were only the beginning. The real test would be whether the hope she had tried to kindle would translate into practical action, whether the connection she had celebrated would be sustained and strengthened in the months to come. Over the next few hours, as the technical team prepared the recording for broadcast on Christmas Day, the Queen received preliminary feedback from the small group of advisors who had been allowed to review it. The response was uniformly positive, but more importantly, it confirmed that the speech had achieved the balance she had been seeking between honesty and hope, between acknowledging loss and celebrating resilience. Sir Edward Young found her in her private sitting room later that evening, reading by the fireplace while Prince Philip dozed in his chair nearby. "The early response suggests this will be very well received, Your Majesty," he reported. "People are saying it feels authentic, that you've captured something important about what this year has meant." The Queen looked up from her book. "I hope so, Edward. I hope it helps people feel that their experiences have been seen and understood, and that their efforts have been appreciated. This had been her primary goal from the beginning, not to deliver a speech that would be remembered for its eloquence, but to offer words that would make people feel less alone and more hopeful. She had drawn on decades of experience in public speaking, but she had also drawn on her own very human experience of living through this extraordinary year. On Christmas morning, as the message was broadcast around the world, the Queen spent a quiet day with Prince Philip at Windsor Castle. They exchanged gifts, attended a small private service in the castle chapel, and spoke by video call with family members who could not be present. It was, in many ways, exactly the kind of simplified Christmas that her message had encouraged people to embrace. The response to the speech exceeded all expectations. Within hours of its broadcast, social media was filled with positive reactions from people of all ages and backgrounds. The phrase, "You are not alone," was quoted thousands of times. The image of the Queen speaking directly to the camera, with a warm firelight behind her, became an iconic representation of leadership during crisis. But perhaps more importantly, the speech seemed to capture and crystallize something that people had been feeling throughout the year but had struggled to articulate. The Queen had found words for the complicated mixture of loss and discovery, sadness, and resilience that had defined 2020 for so many people. In the days that followed, as 2020 drew to a close and the world prepared to enter 2021 with cautious optimism about vaccines and eventual recovery, the Queen's Christmas message stood as a testament to the power of authentic leadership during times of crisis. She had not promised easy answers or quick solutions. Instead, she had offered something more valuable: recognition of shared humanity and confidence in the capacity for ordinary people to do extraordinary things when circumstances require it. The speech would be remembered not just as a historical document marking a unique moment in world history, but as an example of how leaders can speak truthfully about difficult circumstances while still nurturing the hope that makes it possible for people to continue moving forward together. In a year when many institutions and leaders had struggled to find the right tone and message, the Queen had demonstrated that authenticity, combined with genuine concern for others, remained the foundation of effective leadership. As 2020 ended and the new year began, the light that the Queen had spoken about continued to shine in countless acts of kindness, determination, and mutual support around the world. Her words had not created that light, but they had helped people recognize it and draw strength from it as they faced whatever challenges lay ahead.